everybody, and welcome to Self-Help FAQ, the YouTube channel. I'm Barb, your host, and now we continue almost to the end of our series of 12 videos on boundaries and the subcategories of boundaries. This is video 11, where we're going to be talking about how you raise your standards and what often happens when you do. So let's get started. So there's a moment that arrives in personal growth that people don't expect. You start trusting yourself more, you stop ignoring things that bother you, you begin quietly raising your standards for how you want to live, and then something strange happens. Certain relationships start feeling uncomfortable, and some people become irritated. Sometimes they drift away, and the confusing part is this: you didn't become cruel, you didn't become unreasonable. You just became clearer. And clarity often leads to a realization that can be difficult at first. Some relationships only work if you shrink. But what most people don't realize is that when your standards rise, you're not just changing your relationships, you're actually changing the direction of your life. You see, every person lives inside a set of standards. Sometimes those standards are conscious, and sometimes we've been quietly developing them over time such that they're invisible. You know, invisible habits. But those standards quietly determine things like what environments we tolerate, what conversations we take part in, what kinds of behavior becomes normal around us, and what opportunities we pursue or walk away from. Over the years, those small tolerances accumulate, and they shape the life we experience day after day. So when someone raises their standards, they're not just adjusting a few interactions, they're actually changing the conditions under which their life unfolds. Now, most relationships operate under invisible agreements. Not spoken agreements, but patterns. We've talked about patterns before. These patterns may result in changes in relationships over time when you realize they no longer work for you. For example, one person may smooth things over. One person may always adapt. One person may overlook certain things to keep things comfortable. So let me give you a few examples to go deeper into this. Imagine someone in the relationship is always the person that keeps things going. They're the one planning outings. They're the one initiating conversations about the future. They're the one putting energy into the relationship to make it feel alive. For a long time, they might be telling themselves, well, maybe this is just the way relationships are. But over time, they begin to notice something. A healthy relationship should involve effort from both people. So they raise one quiet standard. I want to be in a relationship where both people invest energy. Once that standard becomes clear, something else becomes clear too. Some relationships only continue when one person carries the weight. Here's another example. Sometimes the shift isn't about behavior at all, it's about direction. Imagine being in a relationship where only one person is trying to grow. They're learning new things, they're reflecting on their patterns, they're trying to become more emotionally aware, but their partner has no interest in that kind of growth. Over time, the direction becomes more and more noticeable. The conversations feel different, the priorities feel different, even the future begins to look different. And eventually, the realization appears. It's very hard to build a life with someone who's moving in a completely different direction. Have you ever heard the phrase when someone's explaining the reason for their divorce, and they say, well, we just grew apart. We didn't want the same things. Well, that's that shift in a nutshell. So these patterns I've been talking about are really the unwritten rules of the relationship. When you raise your standards, those unwritten rules change. And when the rules change, sometimes the relationship has to reorganize itself around that. Now, here's something that many people don't even think about. The standards you accept today will determine the trajectory of your life. Some decisions compound over time, and you attract what you put out there. So if you repeatedly tolerate environments that drain you, you'll attract more of the same. If you tolerate relationships where you can't be yourself, then you're going to attract more of those kinds of dynamics. And when standards rise, something else begins to happen. Your trajectory begins to shift. Different opportunities appear. Different people enter your life. Different environments become normal, not because you forced anything, but because your standards quietly change the direction in which you're moving. So when your standards change, it doesn't mean other people are bad. It often simply means the relationship was built around a different version of who you were, that person that no longer exists. The version of you that maybe stayed quiet, the version of you that tolerated discomfort, the version of you who adjusted constantly. When that version of you disappears, the structure of the relationship sometimes disappears with it. And that's why some people drift away, not because you rejected them, but because the dynamic between you no longer exists. And there's another alternative that a lot of people don't talk about in the conversations. They're so focused on people leaving them. Sometimes it's you that leaves, not because you suddenly dislike the person, not because there was just one dramatic event, but because over time you noticed something clearly, that the relationship only works if you lower your standards. Maybe you found yourself constantly explaining the same boundary, or you were constantly overcoming some behavior, or you're repeatedly adjusting yourself to avoid the same tension. At some point, you begin realizing this relationship dynamic, just the things happening between us, it's just not changing. And once you see that clearly, the decision becomes often simpler than you expected. Not easy, but clear. Because raising your standards doesn't just reveal who doesn't fit into your life, it also reveals where you no longer fit. And sometimes the simpler decision is just to step away from that dynamic that requires you to shrink in order to stay. Now, when people raise their standards, there is a transition period that happens where it feels like life is rearranging itself. This is what I call the quiet reorganization period. Certain connections fade, sometimes very painfully, and some environments lose their appeal simply because you're just too tired and unwilling to tolerate them anymore. But something else slowly begins to happen. You start to notice different conversations, different kinds of people, different kinds of opportunities. Your life begins organizing itself around the standards you quietly chose. And over time, those standards become your new normal. Speaking of noticing different kinds of people, when people hear this idea, they immediately want to ask one practical question. Where do I actually find people with these kinds of standards? And the answer is rather simpler than a lot of people expect. We usually meet compatible partners in environments that reflect our own standards or values. If someone spends their time in environments where there is drama, competition, or constant distraction, those environments will produce a certain type of relationship dynamic. But when someone spends their time in environments where people value growth, curiosity, responsibility, or creativity, the relationships that develop there often look different. For example, imagine someone who spends their social time in environments where the focus is mainly on entertainment, like the loud bar scene, parties, or places where conversations rarely go above surface level topics. There's nothing inherently wrong with those environments, but they do encourage a certain kind of interaction. Now imagine the same person starts spending more time in places that reflect different priorities. Places like maybe a class they're interested in, a volunteer group, a language club, a book discussion group, or maybe even church. Suddenly the conversations look different. People are talking about ideas, projects, goals, or things they're learning. Over time, the kinds of relationships in those places will often feel different too. Not because someone deliberately went searching for the perfect partner, but because the environment itself brought together people who share the same kinds of values. In other words, raising your standards doesn't just change your expectations, it gradually changes the environments in which you feel comfortable. And those environments tend to introduce you to people who have similar priorities. And so this can all be boiled down to one phrase. People usually meet compatible partners in environments that reflect their standards. In other words, and put simply, where you spend your time becomes the filter. Now, let's do a little exercise on your future self perspective. One helpful way to think about this moment of when you raise your standards is to imagine your future self, years from now, looking back at the choices you're making today. Would your future self wish you had continued shrinking to preserve certain relationships? Or would they be grateful that you chose honesty about what works for you? Because every time you honor a standard that reflects who you truly are, you are shaping the life that your future self will eventually live inside and be celebrating about. So in the end, raising your standards doesn't mean rejecting people. It means being clear about how you want to live. And sometimes that clarity changes the relationships around you. Some people will adjust, some will drift away, and new connections often appear that align with who you are now. And the most important change is this: you no longer feel like you have to shrink to belong. And that is one of the clearest signs that self-trust has returned. And now it's time for our journal question, which is a two-parter for today. And the questions are: where in my life have my standards quietly begun changing the direction of my future? And what are my new standards? Write them down as: I expect to be treated ... and I will no longer tolerate ... and fill those out. If you'd like to share those with me, you can put them down in the comments. Well, that's it for video 11. Hope you got something out of it. I hope you're marching in the direction of who you want to become, that person that has standards that cannot be lowered for bad treatment. And we'll see you next week for our final video, video number 12 in the series, and also for Follow-Up Friday this week, right after this video on Friday. Thanks a lot. Have a great rest of your day, and bye for now.